To honor the 33 men who died beside him, he had to spend 50 years proving he wasn't the only hero. His reward for saving Guadalcanal was America's highest medal for valor. His burden was a truth that no one else wanted to hear. The file is dated October 26, 1942. The location, a low grassy ridge on an island most Americans had never heard of. An island called Guadalcanal. The scene it describes is one of profound carnage. As the tropical sun burns away the morning mist, it reveals the aftermath of a battle that should have been impossible to survive. The ground is a churned mess of earth and blood. It is littered with the bodies of hundreds of Japanese soldiers, and among them, the bodies of 33 United States Marines. The air is thick with the metallic smell of cordite and death. Spent brass casings lie in glittering piles inches deep around 4 machine gun nests. This was not a skirmish. It was a final stand. And according to the official report, it was a stand made by one man. That man was Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige. The citation for his Medal of Honor is a story of almost superhuman courage. It states that after all the other men in his section were killed or wounded, Paige single-handedly held this ridge against an entire Japanese regiment. He ran from gun to gun, firing them one by one, creating the illusion of a full-strength defense. He held this position alone for hours until reinforcements arrived. A single Marine against thousands. It is one of the greatest stories of heroism in the history of the Corps. But the muster rolls for that night tell a different story. They list 33 other names. Sergeant John Basilone, Corporal Lee Diamond, Private First Class Andy Holcomb. Men who manned those guns alongside Paige. Men who fired until they were cut down. Men who absorbed the bullets and bayonets of the first, second, and third waves of the assault. They were not footnotes. They were the wall, and their sacrifice was slowly, systematically erased from the official memory of the battle. How does this happen? How does the genuine, undeniable heroism of one man cast a shadow so large that it completely obscures the 33 heroes who died at his feet? To find the answer, we have to go back to the hours just before the slaughter began. October 25th, 1942. Night falls on Guadalcanal like a smothering blanket. Mitchell Paige and his rifle platoon are assigned a machine gun section and given a simple, impossible order. Hold a 200-yard sector of the line at any cost. This ridge is the last line of defense for a vital asset, Henderson Field. If the airfield falls, the entire American campaign on the island is doomed. Every man on that ridge knows it. Paige is a career Marine, a gunnery expert. He is not a man given to grand speeches. His after-action debriefing is cold and professional. He describes placing his 4 machine guns for interlocking fields of fire. He details the ammunition distribution. He notes the condition of his men, exhausted, running low on rations but ready. They are a unit, a living organism of 34 men bound by a trust that only exists in places like this. They do not know that on the other side of the jungle, the Japanese Sendai Regiment, over 2,000 strong, is preparing to throw its entire weight against their tiny position. They are the designated fulcrum of the entire Japanese offensive, a force designed to shatter, not just defeat, Paige's small section of the line. The first sign of the attack is not a sound, it is a tremor in the ground, a low, growing vibration. Then the jungle erupts. The jungle did not whisper. It screamed. The sound was a guttural, rising roar from 1,000 throats. A banzai charge. This was not a tactical probe. It was a human wave attack, designed to overwhelm by sheer mass and fanatical courage. Out of the darkness, the first shapes emerged, running low, bayonets fixed. They were a tide of men, and Paige's tiny platoon was the only rock standing in their way. The response was immediate. It was mechanical. It was the result of endless training. Paige gave the order. The 4 Browning machine guns opened fire. The sound was a deafening, cyclical hammering that ripped the night apart. The first wave of Japanese soldiers dissolved into that wall of lead. They did not slow down. They did not waver. They simply died, and the men behind them ran over their bodies. For the first hour, the line held. The 34 Marines worked like a single, well-oiled machine. The gunners kept their bursts short to avoid overheating the barrels. The assistant gunners fed the ammunition belts, their hands moving with a fluid, desperate grace. Paige's own after-action report is brutally sparse on this point. It simply states, "Platoon returned fire and repulsed initial assault." But the reality was a charnel house. The space in front of their position became a carpet of the dead and dying. The stench of blood was thick in the humid air. Then the Japanese changed tactics. Mortar rounds began to fall, not a barrage but precise targeted strikes. They were walking the explosions along the ridge, trying to find the exact location of the guns. A shell landed with a deafening crack just behind the far left machine gun. The gun went silent. Paige yelled for a status report. There was no answer. He knew what it meant. In the chaos, he had lost contact with 1/4 of his firepower. And 8 of his men. The Japanese, sensing the weakness, focused their next charge on that silent position. Paige had no reserves. There was no one to send. According to the testimony of a runner from an adjacent unit, Paige himself sprinted from his command post to the next gun in the line. He physically shifted its field of fire, trying to cover the new gap, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. The Japanese were not just in front anymore. They were infiltrating the flanks, using the darkness and the jungle as cover. A second machine gun crew was overwhelmed, not by the charge, but by a small group of soldiers who appeared suddenly out of the shadows. The fighting was hand-to-hand, bayonets and fists. The gun fired one last, desperate burst towards the sky and then fell silent. 2 guns down, 16 men gone. The line was no longer a line. It was 2 isolated islands of resistance in a sea of attackers. The remaining Marines knew the end was coming. The Japanese records, translated decades later, speak of an unbreakable will on that ridge. But will does not stop bullets. The 3rd gun was the next to go. A direct mortar hit. There was a flash, an explosion, and then nothing. Paige was now with the last remaining gun position. His platoon, his 33 men, had been systematically annihilated over the course of 3 horrific hours. The firing from the last gun was sporadic. The barrel was glowing red. Ammunition was critically low. Then a final Japanese grenade landed in the pit. The last gun fell silent. The roar of the attack subsided. The Japanese, believing they had finally broken the position, were regrouping for the final push to the airfield. On the ridge, there was an eerie silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Sergeant Mitchell Paige was alone. He was surrounded by the bodies of his men. His platoon was gone. His line was broken. And the entire Japanese regiment was just beyond the darkness, preparing to finish the job. For any normal soldier, this was the moment of surrender, the moment of death. But for Paige, it was something else entirely. It was the moment the myth was born. For the Japanese commander on the other side of the ridge, the battle was over. He had thrown his best men at the American line, and the line had been silenced. The final assault on Henderson Field was now a formality. He gave the order to regroup and prepare for the final push. The silence was the sound of his victory. He was wrong. What does a man do when he is the last one left? The declassified debriefing files offer no insight into Mitchell Paige's mind at that moment. They are a cold recitation of facts. But the physical evidence left on that ridge tells the true story. A story of a decision that defies all logic. Paige did not retreat. He did not surrender. He attacked. He ran to the first silent machine gun pit. The crew was gone. The gun was intact. He heaved the heavy Browning onto the parapet, pulled the charging handle, and opened fire into the darkness. The familiar hammering roar shattered the silence. For the Japanese soldiers, it was a shock. A ghost had risen from the grave. They took cover, their advance stalled. But one gun would not hold them for long. They would simply flank it and destroy it. Paige knew this. And this is where his actions moved from bravery into the realm of legend. He fired a long burst, then ceased fire. He abandoned the gun. In the pitch black, he scrambled 50 yards down the line to the second gun position. Again, the crew was dead. The gun was operational. He opened fire from this new position. From the Japanese perspective, the situation had become confusing. First, a gun was firing from the left. Now, one was firing from the center. The American line was not broken, it was still active. They redirected their assault toward the new sound, and as they did, Paige was already moving again. He repeated this act a third time, and a fourth. He was a phantom, a one-man platoon appearing and disappearing in the darkness. The physical feat alone is staggering. A Browning machine gun weighs nearly 40 pounds. The ammunition boxes weighed even more. For hours, Paige ran a desperate, lethal circuit between the four graves of his men, firing from each one, collecting ammunition from the dead, keeping the barrels from overheating. He created the illusion of an unbreakable line. The Japanese accounts, written years later by the few who survived, describe a fanatical and continuous wall of fire from the ridge. They believed they were still fighting a full-strength Marine platoon. They had no idea they were being held at bay by a single exhausted sergeant, but illusions cannot last forever. As dawn approached, a new wave of Japanese soldiers, driven by desperation, finally crested the ridge. This was the end. Paige was at the fourth gun, out of ammunition, when he saw them. The glint of their bayonets in the first light of morning. At that exact moment, a small group of American Marines, a remnant of a different unit sent to reinforce the line, arrived behind him. They were only a dozen men. They saw one sergeant standing alone, facing an entire company of the enemy. It was this image, burned into the memory of the survivors, that would form the core of the myth. Paige did not fall back to join them. He did not give them a report. He did what gunnery sergeants do. He led from the front. He wrenched the hot, empty machine gun from its tripod. Cradling the 40-pound weapon in his arms, he yelled the only order that made sense. He yelled, "Charge!" He ran straight towards the Japanese line, firing the machine gun from his hip. The few remaining Marines, stunned and inspired, followed him. This final impossible act of aggression broke the back of the Japanese assault. They had been fighting ghosts all night. Now the ghosts were charging them. They broke. They fled. The line had held. When the sun was fully up, officers from the command post arrived on the ridge. What they saw was a scene from Dante's Inferno, and in the middle of it all, one Sergeant Mitchell Paige. He was covered in dirt and blood, holding a machine gun. The story wrote itself. A lone Marine had saved Guadalcanal. In May of 1943, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The legend was now official, and with the stroke of a pen, the sacrifice of the 33 men who died holding that line before he began his lonely stand was relegated to the shadows. The war machine needs heroes more than it needs the truth. The truth is messy. It is complicated and painful. A hero is simple, a symbol. And in 1943, America desperately needed a symbol. They found it in Sergeant Mitchell Paige. His journey from the blood-soaked ridge to the cover of national magazines was a blur. He was pulled from the line, his uniform replaced with freshly pressed dress blues. He was no longer a gunnery sergeant. He was a national treasure. The Medal of Honor was placed around his neck by President Roosevelt himself. He was sent on war bond tours, crisscrossing the country, his face plastered on posters. He was the man who had single-handedly saved Guadalcanal. But in the transcripts of his early interviews, you can see the conflict. You can feel the unease. The reporters ask him again and again, what did it feel like to be alone? How did you find the courage to fight a whole regiment by yourself? Paige's recorded answers are careful. He tries to steer the conversation. He says, I wasn't alone. I had 33 good men with me. He tries to name them. He talks about Sergeant Basilone. He talks about Corporal Diamond. But the interviewers always edit it out. It complicates the narrative. The story of a brave platoon is a good story. The story of a lone hero, a demigod rising from the battlefield, is a legend. And America chose the legend. This was the first and perhaps the cruelest betrayal. The erasure was not an act of malice, it was an act of public relations. The names of the 33 Marines were not intentionally hidden. They were simply deemed irrelevant to the larger story. They were inconvenient details in the myth-making process. And what about the families? The mothers, fathers, and wives of the men who died on that ridge? They received a telegram, a folded flag, a standard heartbreaking letter from the Secretary of the Navy, expressing regret. They saw Mitchell Paige's face in the newspapers. They read about the lone hero of Guadalcanal. They had no way of knowing that their son, their husband, had died at that very spot, in that very battle, holding the line that allowed Paige to make his final stand. Their sacrifice was buried in a classified unit citation, filed away in a dusty archive. Their sons became ghosts, forgotten by the country they had died to protect. Paige remained in the Marine Corps after the war. His service record is exemplary. He was a model officer, rising through the ranks to become a colonel. He was respected, he was admired, he was a living legend, and he was trapped inside that legend. For decades, he lived with the quiet burden of the truth. He knew that the medal hanging in his study, the medal he had undeniably earned, had been polished with the invisibility of his men. The years turned into decades. The 1940s bled into the 50s and 60s. The story of his lone stand was now cemented in history books and documentaries. His own attempts to correct the record were dismissed as the humble modesty of a true hero. No one understood that he was not being modest. He was trying to report a theft of valor, committed not by a person but by history itself. Then in the 1970s, something changed. Paige retired from the Corps. The country was reeling from the Vietnam War, and a new, ugly phenomenon began to surface. Military imposters. Men who had never heard a shot fired in anger were showing up at veterans' events, their chests covered in unearned medals. They were stealing the sacrifices of real soldiers for a free drink at a bar. For Colonel Paige, this was the final insult. This was the desecration of a sacred trust. He had watched as the memory of his own men was slowly erased by a sanitized myth. Now he was watching as outright liars tried to steal the honor of an entire generation. The files show that in 1975, he made a decision. He would no longer be a passive guardian of the truth. He would become its champion. He began writing a book he would call A Marine Named Mitch. It was his first salvo in a new war. A war not against a foreign enemy, but against a lie. Paige's book, A Marine Named Mitch, was not a bestseller. It was not a literary sensation. It was a quiet, stubborn statement of fact. In its pages, he did not just recount his own actions. He meticulously listed the name of every single man in his platoon. He described where they were from. He wrote about the jokes they told in the moments before the battle. He gave them back their humanity. For the few military historians who read it, The book was a crucial correction to the historical record. But what is the weight of a single book against half a century of established myth? It was not enough. Not yet. The true breakthrough came from the last place anyone expected. It came from the enemy. In 1987, a Japanese historian was researching the Guadalcanal campaign. He uncovered the personal diary of a Japanese officer who had fought in the battle for that very ridge, an officer who had survived. The diary was a ground-level account, a record of the battle from the other side of the guns. When translated, its pages contained a stunning revelation. The diary did not contradict Paige's story, it completed it. The Japanese officer wrote in vivid detail about the first hours of the attack. He described a hornet's nest of machine gun fire from 4 distinct positions. He wrote about the unbelievable resistance of the American platoon, how they fought to the last man and the last bullet. He detailed how his regiment was bled white, their momentum shattered by the time they finally silenced the American guns. This was the proof. This was the independent, irrefutable corroboration that Paige had been seeking his entire life. The diary proved that the battle for the ridge was not a one-man show. It was a platoon action, a sacrifice made by 34 men. The Japanese officer's testimony gave a voice to the ghosts on the ridge. This new evidence was a key. It unlocked the archives. Historians, armed with the diary and Paige's book, began to re-examine the official records. They dug up the old muster rolls. They cross-referenced the casualty reports, and a new, more complete picture of the battle began to emerge. The story was no longer just about Mitchell Paige's heroic final stand. It was about the heroic stand of his entire platoon that made his own actions possible. Vindication was not a parade. It was a correction printed in the dry academic pages of military history journals. It was a series of articles that finally listed the names of the 33 other men. It was the public acknowledgement that the hero of Guadalcanal was not one Marine. It was 34. For the families of the fallen, it was a revelation that came 45 years too late. But it came. They finally learned the full story of how their loved ones had died. They were not just casualties. They were the heroes who had held the line. The false hero of this story was never Mitchell Paige. He was and remains one of the greatest heroes in the history of the Marine Corps. The real false hero was the myth itself, the simple, clean lie that was created for posters and war bond tours. A lie that served a purpose in wartime, but in peacetime it committed a quiet, ongoing injustice. Colonel Mitchell Paige died in 2003 at the age of 85. He passed away as the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Guadalcanal campaign. He won his first war with machine guns and courage. He won his second, longer war with memory, persistence, and the stubborn truth. The evidence is fragmented. Some details remain disputed, but the core facts are documented in military archives, witness testimonies, and declassified files. And now, when the story is told, the silence feels especially heavy. Before my eyes, I still see the image of an old colonel, a man decorated with his nation's highest honor, spending his final years fighting not for more glory, but for the names of 33 forgotten men. That's exactly why I cannot simply close this file and forget. Because forgetting is the final betrayal we can commit toward the memory of men like them. Their names were stolen by a legend, and it took a lifetime for one of their own to steal them back. If you listen to the end, it means this matters to you too. Just let me know you're here, that I'm not telling this into the void.